I was just saying before we sat down, that as the editor of a section that runs a lot of foreign policy stories, the difficulty or the struggle in a campaign is getting foreign policy off the front page. But we find in this election campaign, foreign policy is smack bang in the middle of the campaign. So I start with you, Richard, and maybe you could just outline for everyone what you see as the major issues and where the big differences are for both sides.
Well, thanks, Lisa, and good morning to everyone, and thanks very much for joining us here today. I've just come back from America, I have to say, where manoeuvring for the 2024 presidential election is well and truly underway. So not for the first time, I say to myself, thank goodness for parliamentary systems and short election campaigns. A couple of quick thoughts on this. First of all, in terms of specific foreign policy, we actually haven't seen a lot of detail rolled out yet. So we have a broad sense of the positions of the major parties. We had a major announcement from the Labor Party on the Pacific yesterday. But there's still, I think, a bit of specific policy to be tipped out. And actually the Foreign Minister is giving a speech today at 11 o'clock. For those of you who might be interested, we may hear some more. Having said that, I mean, you can't escape the major foreign policy issue, which is rolling through the election, of course. It's a case of trying to run from it, but you can't hide it. So at the moment, it's all about China and how to deal with it, with each side trying to cast doubt on the other's credentials for managing the nation's security in this very challenging time. And when I say China, it's not just about China and our very difficult bilateral relationship, but it's much bigger than that, of course. It's about what China's growing power and influence and this very assertive China that we're now dealing with means for China's place in the world, and particularly for our own role in our backyard in Asia and the Pacific. I have to say that's a debate that's shedding a lot more heat than light, and it's a bit hard to untangle claim and counterclaim and come to grips with some of the real policies here. So I want to step back just briefly from the day-to-day. And I think, on China, it's been quite remarkable the way in which it's driven a transformation of so much of Australian foreign policy and our defence policy and a lot of domestic policy. So we've seen the search for a much more offensively capable defence force. We have an Indo-Pacific Strategy, which is all about strengthening our partnerships in the region and balancing China's power. And we have a whole bunch of domestic policies which are about resilience, whether that's 5G or foreign interference or foreign investment in sensitive sectors, or what to do about supply lines for critical technologies. And behind all the heat and all the noise, there's actually a very strong degree of bipartisanship on all of those core policies. So you've seen Labor support the government in major policy decision after major policy decision, mostly because they agree with those decisions, partly, I suspect, because they just don't want to get wedged in the election on national security. So I think regardless of the outcome of the election, we're going to see a fair amount of continuity on China policy, whether it's the domestic policy settings, the regional policy settings, the defence policy settings, or the globals. But so if the opposition if the government is returned, what you see is what you get. You'll get a lot more of that. If the opposition is returned, there'll be a lot of continuity. But it'd be a mistake to think it'll be exactly the same. It's a different group of people, it's a different party, so it'll be same but different, and over time some of those differences might become more apparent. The opposition has said that it's going to tone down the rhetoric. It's accused the government of politicising the relationship, creating a climate of fear about China and sort of false binaries. So it hopes that toning down the rhetoric will ease the relationship with China. To that, I think we should say we should hope for that, but not necessarily expect that. Labor's also said that the government's underinvested in its relationships in Asia and in the Pacific, and it uses the China frame to make this argument. I don't think that's an entirely fair accurate. In fact, we're spending record amounts of aid in the Pacific at the moment. We've done a lot of good things in Southeast Asia. But you'll see that the opposition has pledged to do a lot more. They've rolled out this big Pacific package, and they've said there's more that will come on Southeast Asia. Look, and just a couple of other bits that we haven't heard about. Trade policy, I know we're going to talk about, but there are some significant differences there on foreign policy, and other issues which have been totally obliterated in all the emphasis on China. But were there to be a change of government, there are bits of the Labor agenda that are traditional Labor Party interests that we'll see more of. Nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, for example, which has been overshadowed. And Labor traditionally pays a lot of attention and puts a lot of weight on the health of the multilateral system and Australia's engagement in it. Anyway, that's probably too much because I got lost in the China story, so I'm going to stop.
Sure. So I'll just pick up on a few things that you mentioned. Obviously, the point of differentiation at the moment is on the Pacific, with Labor rolling out its policy this week. And we had the security pact signed between China and Solomon Islands last week. That was untimely, to say the least, for the government, wasn't it? And do you think that the Pacific, whoever wins government, the Pacific is going to be the big foreign policy issue, at least in the near term, for the next government?
Look, I think the Pacific is going to be one of the big foreign policy issues, but Australia's interests are pan-regional. In fact, they're pan-global. So we can't afford to be a one foreign policy or a one region country, right? The Pacific is incredibly important to Australia's security and our prosperity. It's the closest region to us, and it's the region in which our partners expect us to pull our weight. It's also we're also the country to which the region itself looks to be the best possible partner we can be. So we're going to spend a lot more money, I think, in the Pacific, whoever wins, and we're going to be constantly looking for ways to respond to the region's needs, partly because we should. It's the right thing to do for Australia. It helps the region, and helping the region helps us. But inevitably, of course, we are now in this competition for influence and standing in the Pacific that we just didn't have really a decade ago.
And just specifically on the pact that was signed, you obviously spent a lot of time in government. This probably would have been something you had to deal with. Do you think the government was taken by surprise, and how concerned do you think they are about this pact?
No, I don't think the government was taken by surprise. We've seen people like Andrew Shearer, who's the Director of National Intelligence, speak on the record now, and it's no secret that we've been tracking China's interest in strengthening its security relations in the Pacific for many years now. The phrase whack-a-mole has come up a bit. That's a bit what it's been like. You see something that is potentially worrying and you try and head it off, but to head it off, you have to have an alternative. You have to have a better option for Pacific Island governments who are going to make their own choices here and exercise their own agency. It is a serious blow, I think, to Australia's interests and standing in the region. I mean, we would want to be the primary, if not the dominant provider of security to the Solomon Islands. I don't think it's in Australia's interest to have an authoritarian country like China training the Solomon Islands police, let alone establishing a toehold for PLA Navy ship visits and things.
So obviously foreign policy and the economy are the big issues, and I'll just go to Su-Lin now, because yesterday there was ripple across the Financial Review newsroom as the inflation figure came out, 5.1%, higher than expected, and the fastest in 2 decades, I think, in over 2 decades. Partly that's driven by fuel prices and supply chain issues. So how are the geo-economic uncertainty, how's that affecting Australia's economy, and how do you see that playing out in the election?
So that's a big question.
Yes.
And there's lots of moving parts in terms of that. But I guess what I would do is highlight probably three key macro themes globally that really have implications for Australia and will be discussed as this campaign unfolds. So the first of those is really around elevated and rising inflation globally. And I think, Richard, you were saying you're in the US and that was dominating a lot of the media there. Obviously, with the Australian inflation numbers yesterday, it's taken a whole new focus here, but it's not really a new thematic. So this story of rising inflation really emerged in the second half of last year, and it's accelerated in early 2022. And if we wind back, when it started emerging last year, particularly in advanced nations, it was really this combination of a lot of stimulus in the global economy over the last couple of years. We've seen unprecedented monetary policy action, so official rates in most developed countries close to zero or thereabouts. It's also added stimulus that's come from fiscal settings as well, where, again, unprecedented amounts of government spending to get through the pandemic. So that combination of extraordinarily loose policy settings, supporting demand, and then meeting the constraints of supply chain disruption from various waves of COVID. And really the supply chains have never recovered. As we get, the Delta wave and then the Omicron wave, it's added every time. So this combination of strong demand, reduced supply has obviously driven up prices. And when we look across the advanced world, inflation is running at multi-decade highs, so 6 to 7%. 8.5% in the case of the US, that's probably right at the very end. But it's a very real phenomenon, and one that I think is dominating from a number of angles, whether it's markets, policymakers, and the rest. So that's really the key theme. Much of that is spilling over to Australia. So some of the global influences from supply chain disruption, from the war in Ukraine, an added factor in terms of energy and food prices. That's coming through very clearly as well. Some unique Australian factors like the floods have added to that. And so that global thematic very much spilling over to Australia to deliver the kind of numbers that you saw yesterday in terms of inflation. The second important theme globally that is linked to the first, that has very important implications for Australia, that we will see front and centre for at least the next week, if not the entire election campaign, is rising interest rates. So rate hikes. So when we look across the global central banking space, central banks are at various stages of moving away from those near zero type settings, those ultra accommodative settings. And in G10 space, so the advanced world, New Zealand began that in October of last year. The Bank of England started hiking rates in December, Bank of Canada early this year, and most importantly, the US Fed has started. So to varying degrees, these central banks are moving away, and they're doing so because inflation is well above their targets. In some cases, there's fears that it's probably getting a little unhinged, for want of a better word, or that's what markets would say. And when we look across what financial markets are pricing, they are pricing multiple rate hikes in a number of these countries. And if anything, what we would define as a front loading of rate hikes. So, for example, New Zealand and Canada, just rather than lifting by a quarter basis points, moved by 0.5%, both those countries recently. We ourselves expect the Fed to hike by 0.5% next month and another 0.5% thereafter, and then pretty much every meeting until the end of the year. So you're looking at a fairly aggressive pace of tightening, albeit from very low levels. Again, implications for Australia because our inflation dynamics, there are some similarities, and because really we would argue, frankly, at 0.1%, it's a very inappropriate level of cash. Really, there is no reason why we should be sitting at emergency cash when the Reserve Bank has effectively met its dual mandate. We're pretty close to full employment at 4%, and I know everybody around here knows that number. And inflation, not only is it above target, but the odds are it's going to stay above target, Reserve Bank's target, for much of this year. So a lot of focus on that 5.1, which is the headline rate of inflation. But for economists and policymakers, really the key numbers are these core measures, the ones that strip out volatile items. Economists like to strip out things that matter for households, but that number is running close to 3.5%. So again, through the ceiling of the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% range, and it's going to remain there. The actions of global central banks matters for the RBA. It has said on more than several occasions that what global central banks do factors into their policy deliberations. It's part of the reason that aggressive global central banking stance, coupled with the domestic considerations here of full employment and rising inflation, is why we expect the Reserve Bank to begin hiking rates next week. And we're not alone. Lots of, the street are expecting it. Financial markets are well priced. It is well and truly time for the bank to get moving. It looks quite out of step with the rest of the world.
But that would be the first interest rate hike during a campaign since 2007 when the Rudd government came to power. So how does it play out in election campaign?
I think it's a really interesting dynamic. So the RBA is independent. It, really has been since the mid-90s. It, I think, prides itself on its independence, and it's not common for them to move during election campaigns, but really I think overwhelmingly the economic arguments and the outlook suggests that they do need to get moving on rates. I think one of the key lessons, if the bank is looking around the globe at what other central banks are doing, a very key lesson that's emerging at the moment is the sooner you go, the better. The less you're likely to have to do, the less likely you are to find yourself like the Fed and being, needing to scramble and catch up and deliver big hikes. The sooner you get going, the sooner you get to neutral, the more optionality you have to face other external shocks, the more likely the peak in cash rates will be lower. And so that's the big question. Everyone's hiking, we're going to join that path, but how high are rates going to go? And that, I think, will dominate the election campaign as well. So I think what's really interesting from the economic perspective is, we're pretty positive on the Australian economy, notwithstanding a number of challenges. Clearly, households and businesses have proved very resilient. The labour market is extraordinarily healthy with multi-decade lows in the unemployment rate. The outlook is strong as well. So, all the kind of official data and all the numbers and all the detail we look at is really strong. Yet, I think there's a real disconnect with what voters feel, because what voters will tell you is, great, I've got a job and, my mortgage payments have been low. But what I'm worried about is cost of living, because it's really visible, fuel prices, food prices, rents beginning to lift. What I feel is higher cost of living. I worry about rates rising and my mortgage rates rising, which we haven't seen for over a decade. And, for a lot of people, wages growth in real terms has not lifted. And that's the argument that the opposition is prosecuting quite heavily. There is truth and merit in that, and we can talk about why wages and those dynamics are low, but that, I think, is an important development. So I think, in summary, we're looking at that global inflation picture and what it means for Australia, the implications for cash rates and rising rates here and mortgage rates. And I think tied to all of that, through the spectrum of Ukraine and Russia and the elevated energy and food prices, the net impact on global growth is lower and higher on inflation. Now, that has also implications for Australia as a small open economy, but particularly China, because its pursuit of zero COVID is an added new disruption to supply chains, inflation, and obviously growth as well. So again, you're seeing the global body start to revise down, not just global growth, but also Chinese growth.
And you mentioned accidentally net zero there. So in the absence of Patrick, I'm going to put Richard in the hot seat on climate change, because it too is at the forefront of this campaign. We've got a group of independents that are running largely on climate change issues. The prospect of a hung parliament is being talked about. So how do you see that playing out for climate change policies of the next government?
Yeah, so I'm a poor substitute for Patrick here, given his not just his personal passion and commitment, but his deep knowledge, both working with government and now with the private sector. But climate change and clean energy are one big point of difference in this election campaign, although Labor is not exactly shouting it because they're still scarred by the last election. So, the key data points here are both of the major parties have committed to net zero by 2050. This is the big commitment that was made at the last meeting of the Conference of Parties. But there's a fairly significant difference in the midterm ambition here. So for the election, the coalition has stuck with their 26 to 28% reduction by 2030 on 2005 levels, whereas Labor's target for 2030 is 43%. Now, the midterm ambition target is fairly important because if Patrick were here, he would tell you that actually to get to net zero by 2050, we have to do a lot of the work now. And if you backload it, you just won't get there. And in fact, Patrick's view, his own view, is that we should be aiming for 50% reduction by 2030 to make the net zero target. So midterm ambition is the key point of difference. The other big point of difference in the election campaign is how do we get there? So the coalition is betting big on technology. It says that technology will help get us there. And that's both technologies that we know exist now and ones that we aren't quite sure whether they'll exist now, including at scale like carbon capture and storage. Labor is not technology blind. It also puts a lot of emphasis on technology, but if you have a look at its climate policy, it has a whole bunch of other measures that it's going to invest in. It wants to fix the electricity grid so that it can take more renewables, for example, without causing problems in the stability of the grid. It's got community solar panels, it's got battery programs, it's got electric vehicle programs and so on. I think two other points about climate change. One on the foreign policy aspects of the climate change. Labor argues in the campaign that its midterm commitment, the 2030 commitment, aligns Australia more closely, not just with our close partners like the United States, the UK, the European Union, Japan and Korea, all of whom have midterm targets above 40%, but also very importantly in the Pacific. So the climate change debate is playing very strongly into the foreign policy dimensions of our engagement with the Pacific, with Labor arguing that our current approach is a drag on our influence in the Pacific. Now, I do personally think there is something in that, although you can overstate it, because foreign policy is essentially about countries pragmatically trading off interests. So while our current climate change settings are dragging behind our close partners, and the Pacific Islanders certainly do complain about them, it hasn't stopped us getting on and getting a lot done. Very last quick point, which is on the role of the independents. So if you look at really the largest group here, which are the so-called teal independents, their platform is for a 75% cut to emissions on 2005 levels by 2030. So that is really ambitious.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, if there's a hung parliament, how much can that shape policy on either side of the government?
Yep.
Well, I don't think anyone's going to commit to 75% because I just don't think we can get there. And here's where you, Lisa, and others perhaps around this table are probably going to better idea than I about how this group might line up in a hung parliament, because they're not a party, right? They're a sort of a loose coalition of aligned independents. Many of them are running in Liberal seats. So while their climate policy pushes them closer to their Labor, the seats they're in and other aspects of their policies might push them closer to the coalition. So how that panned out in what would be, I think, a pretty messy negotiation would be interesting to watch.
I agree. And just back to put your foreign policy head back on again. If you look at the developments under the Morrison government, major foreign policy developments, we've had AUKUS and the Quad, and that has changed the way that Australia engages with a whole host of countries, including our close region. So under a new government, do you see anything changing with those groupings? And how do you think, it hasn't really come up as a campaign issue, but do you think there's any point of differentiation between two major parties?
Not on Quad and AUKUS. Labor is very comfortable with both those groups. Of course, they whack the government over the head on the submarine program, but neither party has a glorious history on Australia's submarines, which some of you may or may not remember were first promised in Kevin Rudd's 2008 Defence White Paper. And here we are in 2022, and we don't even have the beginnings of the first submarine, and our Collins-class submarines are antiques. They're not just old, they're antiques. So not on Quad or AUKUS. I think the more interesting question here is, although the current government doesn't always put it together in as clear a way as I would like, there is actually quite a clear Indo-Pacific strategy that the government's been running in recent years, and which I had a part in shaping when I was still in government, and it has a number of key elements. So one of those elements is investing heavily in our own relationships in Asia. This is about sustaining our own influence and standing in a much more competitive region. The second pillar is doing what we can to support the region's own resilience and autonomy. So that's about giving them choices, whether it's trade or investment or development assistance or security assistance, or even vaccines, as the case may be. The third is a slightly harder edge balancing agenda, not to contain China's power, which nobody in the Australian system thinks is either possible or sensible to try, but certainly to try and balance China's power so that China will be very powerful and influential in Asia, inevitably, of course, it already is, but not hegemonic. And that's where the Quad and AUKUS comes in, that's where the alliance comes in, that's where the relationship with India and Japan comes in. And then the last part of that strategy is trying to keep the peace where we can. So I don't think we've heard Labor bring together the elements. So would we see exactly the same kind of approach to the Indo-Pacific, which even though those outside government might find it hard to put the picture together precisely, really does exist. So that's one unanswered question, I think. And then the last thing I'd say about the Indo-Pacific is it's hard now, but it's going to get harder. So whoever wins the next election is going to face many challenges, many more consequential policy decisions. There's a risk of a crisis on the Taiwan Straits or in the South China Sea. There are very consequential decisions happening around our alliance relationship. I sometimes wonder how much Australian public is paying attention, including what's happened in Northern Australia. But our what's called the forced posture work with America will mean that we'll have more American troops here more often. We've already accepted visits by any type of American aircraft, including strategic bombers. There'll be more ship visits, there'll be more facilities built. So our strategic geography is becoming really important. ASEAN as an institution is in trouble at the moment. I think it is divided over what to do about China, what to do about China and America. It's divided over Russia and Ukraine. It's divided over Myanmar. And it's struggling to build the sorts of consensus decisions that can show agency here. It's anxious about being worked around through the Quad and AUKUS. So, I mean, I'll stop here, but there's just a lot on the Indo-Pacific, well beyond Quad and AUKUS that's going to keep the next government, whether it's a returned government or a new government, very busy and really on their toes.
And obviously, Su-Lin, that changes the way Australia engages politically, but also economically with the world. How do you think those developments have sort of affected our sort of trade outlook? And as you talk about that, you mentioned before we sat down that you think this election's about national security, cost of living, and both of those things are seen through political leadership. Can you expand on that a bit in terms of?
Sure. I guess maybe to pick up on the first part in terms of the economic relationship and trade in a quite uncertain and challenging regional environment. What is quite key, I think, as we build relationships in the region and, as economists, we think about our major trading partners. Clearly, there's no getting around the dominance of China as the largest major trading partner and export market, takes, a disproportionate amount of Australia's key commodities, and that has grown substantially over the last 2 decades since it joined the World Trade Organization. But I think what we've seen over the last 2 years as that relationship's become more fractured is businesses, and where we have seen, for example, protectionist measures put on multiple Australian exports. We have seen businesses pivot and look for alternative markets within the region. And they've done so quite successfully, from Australian coal through to Australian seafood and fresh produce. And I think building those stronger relationships, Richard, that you talk about in the region adds to that, and that kind of diversification of Australian exports will be an ongoing theme as we go forward. It's, I think, particularly important because in terms of iron ore in particular, especially, which is Australia's largest export, by far, China takes that disproportionate amount, and we all know the story there. But China is building its own alternative sources of high-grade iron ore. Can't do it overnight, absolutely, and there is a certain dependency there, but it won't be there forever. And you can see, for example, in particular, their investments in Simandou is part of that. So I think building those other relationships in the region from an economic perspective will be quite important. Richard talks about, the challenges for either side post-election in terms of foreign policy. It will be the same on the economic front as well. And so while we are quite optimistic on growth in the labour market in the near term, we have to remember a lot of that is because of this huge amount of stimulus that is still in the system. As that withdraws, both on the fiscal side, and we're already seeing that, plus the monetary side, the real challenges are 12 to 18 beyond the next 12 months. Where does growth come from? Where, does the budgetary position go? How are we prepared for the next shock? And there, the policy ammunition is quite depleted when you look at where rates are, where you look at the fiscal position. So the challenge for both sides, and they don't want to talk about it, is really on the budgetary front, and that encompasses a number of issues. But ultimately, Australia still runs a structural deficit. So expenditure as a percentage of GDP, it obviously surged to 31% or so during pandemic. It is projected to come down, but at 20, I think it's budget's got it around, call it 26, 27%. That's nearly 2 percentage points above the long run average. Revenue kind of stays stuck around the long run average. So you've got this gap of about 1.5 percentage points of GDP at a time where we know there are structural pressures on expenditure, whether it's health, whether it's social security, and probably more importantly, defence. So I think they're the longer term challenges. And interestingly, when we think about this election through those 3 key issues, the economy, national security, and both of those through the prism of leadership and credibility, that is quite challenging, I think, all round. So that's what we're focused on. Interestingly, despite the economy being this incumbent government's natural strengths and I think perceived advantage, we've heard very little about economic policy. Neither side has big ticket differences or big ticket policy differences. Now, you can argue that that's deliberate given what happened in 2019 and Labor have not put out a lot. There are some minor differences, but no big ticket items. And in particular, I think for the economic community, there is no reform at all, no significant reform, which ultimately is what you need once we come out of all the stimulus and whatever else to lift real wages, to lift potential growth and to lift living standards. That doesn't come, there's no shortcuts to that. That comes from productivity gains and reform agendas, and there is none of that.
Okay. Well, I might open it up to questions if somebody has a question.
Thank you very much. My question is around, Su-Lin mentioned it before, around supply chains and China. And throughout most of the pandemic, China seemed more or less open.
Duckling was supposed to be in this.
He does.
No, I was going to see how he performed, but he was ambassador for environment, so they would talk about climate change or something like that.
Sorry, and just to, well, right now, we've got a bit of an unpredictable situation with China's possibly supply chain. My question is around how does that impact our approach to probably, our policies around finance, economics, and if supply chains are disrupted in a significant way, what is left in the tank for us to combat or address such challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've seen multiple periods of supply chain disruption. And as I said, I think China pursuing that zero COVID policy is a new disruption. They seem to have managed it fairly well last year, but that's absolutely not the case this year. And we've obviously seen lockdowns in key parts of China that are important manufacturing hubs for global production. I think either way it develops in China, they're pretty much they're in a very difficult position. You either continue with your zero COVID and exacerbates that, or you start to do what the rest of the world has done and, obviously infections soar and their vaccination rates aren't as high and you'll see continued disruption. So it is pretty challenging. I think from the perspective of, like I said, inflation and growth, they add to what already is that dynamic. And again, that has consequences not just for Australia, but the globe and, the kind of key thematics that I was talking about. What can be done about it? I think the worry from my perspective, and it probably ties into the broader policy, is that even pre-COVID, this term, economies were already becoming a bit more inward looking, right? It seems a long time ago, but with Trump and trade wars, we're already getting to some degree some deglobalization. Now, for economists, that is never a great thing. You can argue that it's pursued with good intentions to secure your supply, whether it's critical technology, whether it's medical supply and PPE. There's recent discussion around medicine production in Australia. So you can argue, a case for that. But in the context of global economies and global growth, what it will end up being is quite costly. Australia can produce PPE and medicines, but it will cost more here. We don't have a huge comparative advantage in that. And I think you run the risk that the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, which has obviously focused everyone on energy security and alternative sources, countries will pursue that, but they're not the best economic outcomes ultimately. Australia in particular, as a small open economy, has benefited enormously from globalisation. Over decades, okay, there's bumps here and there, but over decades. So I think for me that is the worry. You can do it, and you can see, I think, governments, including here in Australia, play to that sort of nationalistic approach, but it will come at an economic cost.
Is there another question?
We did talk about climate change earlier on in the discussion, but just looking ahead for the next 5 years, 7 years, you've got 2030 targets. We've talked about not just in Australia, but also across the Asia region, across the world. Both from a macroeconomic perspective and from a diplomatic perspective, what kind of things do you think we might see over the next term office that might impact Australia's relationships with the region? So, Pacific Islands and adaptations and all these. China, you've got a 2060 target out there. Even with 2060, the next 5 years is pretty crucial for actually starting to deliver. I think it's going to get pushed into the long grass. Do you think it's too hard? Do you think actually this might be an opportunity for Australia over the next 5 years, or something where we might find ourselves as laggards and not really kind of
Patrick?
Well, I'll have a go, but Su-Lin should have a go as well. I think just on the Pacific, one thing that makes the current government grind their teeth a bit is that China gets a free ride in the Pacific while Australia gets whacked. Whereas, China's own target is, well, very important, but not as ambitious as we would like to do. And we all know the coal story in China, which has a long way to burn, no bad pun intended. I think whoever wins the election, there is an opportunity here. Right? There's going to be an argument over ambition and midterm targets, and if the coalition is returned, that will continue to dominate. Or the coalition that has inched its way towards a more ambitious midterm target in any event. But regardless of who wins, there is an opportunity here. Because if you look at the actual practical policy agenda, there's lots that can be done. Putting aside the argument about the targets, right? So mitigation and adaptation, an important one. We already work in the region on that, but there's a hell of a lot that can be done. The other thing that can be done, where I do think we have something to offer the region, is on clean energy transitions. Mm-hmm. So if you look into Southeast Asia, the profile of their energy sectors in many of those economies, Indonesia is a classic example, is very like Australia, which is hugely dependent on fossil fuels. Indonesia is largely coal, for example. So the transition they have to make is going to be incredibly difficult. And there is an opportunity for Australia to pitch in and help with really substantive clean energy partnerships that are about policies, they're about regulations, and they're about technology.
I would probably add to that regardless of who wins on the 21st of May, businesses are already leading and will continue to do so. So in my world, in terms of capital markets, every conversation we have with corporates, and we are big players in the issuance of bonds for a number of either corporates or super sovereign nationals, increasingly investors are voting with their capital, and global capital is mobile. So, the explosion in terms of green bonds, ESG, sustainably linked bonds, sustainably linked loans, all of that will dominate. So the greening of the capital system is really the dominant theme for us over the next 10 years. So, it would be great if the governments provided more clarity, more incentives and the rest, but businesses will go ahead and do it anyway because capital is demanding that. So I think that's really quite key. But the other observation I'd make is that, clearly this war in Ukraine has heightened the focus on energy security and diversification of energy sources. Australia clearly, has potentially some upside there because I think it's very important in the energy transition to cleaner energy around renewables. But in reality, in places like Indonesia, gas is going to have to play some role. And Australia clearly, key in that space. Some of it's a bit easier said than done. Europe's dependence on Russian gas, which is nearly 40% of their exports. It's not that easy for Australia to kind of pump gas all the way to Europe. Like the practicalities of that are probably not possible. But it's less so in Asia. There are more opportunities, definitely, particularly when you look at some of the newer technology where it's not just pipeline, but, it's from the Northwest Shelf, it comes out, you stick it on a boat and it goes. So there are opportunities there. It's not ideal. It's not as clean and green as clearly, other forms, but that transition is so huge in parts of Asia that I think there is a role for gas.
We've remained fairly quiet on hydrogen and the role it could play in energy security and the role we could play in the region. Do you have any thoughts you could share on that?
I'm not a huge hydrogen expert.
Well, I mean, there are some countries that are hoping and betting big on hydrogen. Japan, for example, particularly in the light of the point that Su-Lin Ong. But I suspect, Brie, you should be sitting up here and talking about the climate change questions, having listened to your background. But of course, the thing about hydrogen is, can we crack clean hydrogen at scale? Because it will help Japan if they're burning hydrogen, but it won't help Australia or the world if that hydrogen is made using coal, brown coal, for example. So the technology challenge here, the moonshot, if you like, is to crack hydrogen at scale using clean energy. Can it be done? I don't know. I hope so. See.
We have time for one more question, I think. I don't know what one. One more question.
I'd be interested to know if you think this election's foreign policy has played a bigger role in the conversation. From my own memory, I can't remember topics such as European crises or overseas supply chain issues that are featuring so heavily in discussions.
Yeah, I think it definitely has. I can't remember either. It's certainly in recent elections, an election where the state of the world has been so prominent, and that's understandable because you don't have to use apocalyptical language to look out on the world and see that it is exceptionally challenging for us. And we had a long run, as the foreign policy wonks like me used to say, after the collapse of Soviet Union in the post-Cold War stage. It was really good for a country like Australia. We benefit out of globalisation much more than many other countries did. We benefit from a generally very secure and stable world. We benefited from unrivaled US power. The unipolar moment worked for us. It didn't always work for everyone in the world, but it worked for us. And so that was a long period of security and unbroken economic growth. And now that world is gone. It's totally gone. It's not coming back. We shouldn't think it's coming back. We're going to be in a much more challenging world to navigate, a more multipolar world, a much more contested and dangerous world. And we're going to have to be on our toes. We shouldn't be pessimistic about that. We've got a hell of a lot going for us, but we will have to be on our toes all the time and bring our A game to it.
That seems like a good, if not cheery, note to finish on.